At 4 a.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway. My fiancée was creeping toward the back door, shoes in hand. She slipped outside, met a man by the fence, and they walked off together. An hour later, she returned alone, hair messy, shirt on backwards, and pretended she'd just gone out for air. I woke because the house changed its breathing. The heater clicked off, the steady hum in the walls thinned, and the silence picked up a new sound that did not belong to sleep. It was faint at first, a soft drag against the hallway runner, then a careful pause near the coat rack, then the whisper of fabric brushing drywall. I kept still and let my eyes adjust to the dark. The red digits on the bedside clock showed 4 a.m., which meant there was no good reason for anyone to be moving around except to go to the bathroom. The bathroom door never opened. Our bedroom door had been left slightly ajar the night before. A thin triangle of gray showed the hall. I watched that little wedge of nothing and saw a shadow lean across it, slow and deliberate, the way a person moves when they are managing a noise problem. A shoe tapped the floor and then didn't, because it slipped into a hand. Another shoe followed. The shadow shrank. The hall went still again. Then a hinge far away made a polite, throat-clearing sound. The back door. I slid my feet to the floor and matched her silence. Every house has its map of treacherous planks, and I knew ours well. I moved around the one near the dresser that chirps, avoided the soft spot by the vent, and kept my weight on the rug until I reached the threshold. From there, the kitchen was a rectangle of dimness cut by the window over the sink. The moon gave the yard a washed-out look, like a bad print, just enough light to extract shapes. I stayed against the wall and looked through the glass. She came into view at the edge of the patio. Bare legs, an oversized tee, shoes in one hand, hair tied, then untied, like the tie had given up. She didn't turn around. She crossed the flagstones and paused at the fence where the lilacs make a darker band. A figure separated from that band and became a man. He did not speak loud enough for sound to carry. He tilted his head toward the alley. She nodded. They moved along the fence line and out of sight. There are moments when a person makes a loud decision inside a quiet room. I didn't shout. I didn't throw on a coat and follow. I let the cold from the glass move into my fingers, and I watched the fence as if it could tell me something else. It told me there was space enough for two people to leave a backyard without disturbing a neighborhood. It told me our floodlight motion sensor was pointed at the wrong corner. I checked the time again, 4:03 a.m. I stood there long enough to count past the idea that I had imagined it. She had met a man by the fence and walked off with him. That fact did not rearrange itself into anything better, no matter how long I looked at the sky above the lilacs. I returned to the hall, made the bed look like it had always contained one sleeping shape, lay down, and faced the door. An hour is longer than it looks on a digital clock. I watched the minutes slide by, each one the same rectangle with a new number. At 5:01 a.m. the back door side open again. I stayed still and listened for the small sounds that tell you a story without asking for your opinion. The rubber soles touched tile, 2 steps, and a stop. A garment turned inside out, and then decided to remain that way. The refrigerator door opened and closed. Water ran for exactly the amount of time it takes to wet a face and rinse a mouth. She came down the hall, paused at the doorway, and stood there long enough to check whether I was breathing in the heavy way I breathe when I sleep. Then she slipped into bed, faced away, and matched the rhythm. Dawn did not soften anything. It just painted it in a cleaner light. When I got up, she was on the sofa with a blanket and her phone. The shirt she wore had the tag showing at the collar, which is the kind of mistake you do not make if you dressed in a well-lit room. She said she woke early and stepped out for air because the house felt stuffy. She gestured vaguely toward the back door, as if the air outside had a signature scent we both recognized. I nodded and went to make coffee. I did not mention the fence. I did not mention the second pair of footsteps I had heard in the shape of a missing sound. While the kettle hissed, I looked at the backyard through the same window and tried to read the grass like a field note. There were no shoe prints you could call evidence. The lilac leaves looked ordinary. A spider had repaired its web near the motion light, which told me the night had been calm enough for delicate work. The world gives very little to someone who wants it to confess. I brought her a mug and watched steam rise between us. She put her phone face down on the cushion, which is a small act with a big meaning. I made a plan I did not announce. The plan had modest first steps and a direction. I would map the night the way a surveyor marks property, with clean lines and dates. Before work, I drove to a big box store and stood in a bright aisle lined with hands-free solutions for people who don't want to trip over cords. I bought a pair of small cameras that promised clear night vision and gentle installation. Back home on my lunch break, I mounted one above the back door inside, tucked into the crown molding so it could see anyone leaving. I hid the other outside beneath the eave facing the gate, angled to watch the fence line without catching the neighbor's windows. I checked the app and made sure timestamps were synchronized and storage was set to roll over. I chose a neutral notification tone and turned off push alerts. I did not want to live like a home alarm. I spent the rest of the day in a normal routine that felt rented. Work emails, a meeting about a meeting, traffic that moved and then didn't. When I came home, she was in a different shirt, this one properly oriented. She talked about a coworker's birthday cake and a rumor about a project. I kept my side of the conversation balanced and uninteresting, which meant she had no reason to look for anything unusual in my eyes. At midnight, she was asleep before me, which is not unusual on weekdays. I lay awake and measured the new silence that sits between two people when one of them is acting out a version of their life. It is not loud, but it expands. The cameras did their work with their tiny red dots, and I did mine by not staring at the hallway like a guard dog. I slept in pieces. The second night, nothing moved. The gate camera recorded a stray cat and a moth the size of a coin. The third night, the house stayed still again. A pattern either forms or it does not. On the fourth night, at 3:58 a.m., the inside camera caught a shape moving from bedroom darkness to kitchen dim. Shoes in hand. The same careful steps. The same backdoor breath. The outside camera caught her silhouette against the fence and captured the moment when the lilac shadow thickened and split. The man had waited in the darker strip where the alley cuts off the neighbor's motion light. He raised a hand in greeting, and she matched it with a small wave. They walked out of frame toward the service road. I watched the clips at 5 in the morning sitting at the kitchen table with yesterday's coffee reheated. The footage was not cinematic. It was grainy and clinical. The timestamps gave it a spine. 3:58, 3:59, 4:01, 5:07. Numbers do not mind what they are attached to. They simply mark the path. Evidence doesn't solve anything by itself. It only removes certain lies from the menu. I saved the files to a drive, labeled them by date, and made a second copy that lived somewhere she would never think to search. I changed nothing about the way I said good morning. She came in from the shower wearing the first shirt again, the one that had been backwards, now correctly arranged. She scrolled through her phone with the new practice of tilting the screen away. I washed a plate that didn't need washing and realized I had stopped picturing a wedding in spring. It had been replaced by a grid of knights and gates and a man who fit into the darkness like he had practiced. Later that day, I parked 2 blocks from her office and watched people come and go, not because I wanted to surprise her, but because I wanted to understand how many doors existed in the life I thought I knew. She left at 5:30 with a coworker and headed to a busier street. Nothing suspicious happened. I went home, fed myself, and sat with the quiet plan as if it were a small animal that might startle. At 4 a.m., I had heard footsteps. Now I had their echo filed and dated. That was the start. The next part would not be about guessing. It would be about names and plates and the kind of daylight that makes people look less like shadows and more like problems that can be solved. By the time a week passed, I had more than one clip. 3 separate early morning departures, all with the same details. Shoes in hand, the slight pause at the fence, the man stepping out from the lilac shadow. The timestamps told their own story. Mondays and Thursdays, always between 3:55 and 4:05 a.m. She returned just over an hour later, never carrying anything, never looking around before coming back in. If she was careful in the leaving, she was careless in the returning. Patterns don't just appear. They reveal what someone thinks is safe to repeat. I wasn't interested in confronting her yet. Confrontation only forces people into new lies before you understand the old ones. Instead, I turned the footage into a map. I marked times, days, even the way the man stood at the fence, body angled away from the camera, head down. He had habits too. The camera caught enough of his face once to show he wasn't young. Maybe mid-40s. Dark jacket every time. His gait had a stiffness that could be age or injury. I froze the frame where his profile was clean against the neighbor's garage light and printed it. I needed more than an image. I needed a name. That's where Daniel came in. My cousin's job wasn't glamorous, mostly network maintenance for a logistics firm, but he knew how to work with data in ways that could cross the thin line between clever and illegal if you didn't watch your step. I told him I suspected Marissa of seeing someone, left out the financial angle for now. I just said I needed to know who the man was. The outside camera had caught his license plate on the third night. Grainy, but the numbers were readable. Daniel ran it through a contact who owed him a favor. 2 days later, I had a name, Colin Webb. The name didn't mean anything to me at first, but Daniel didn't stop there. He sent me a link to a court records database. Colin had been charged 3 years ago with wire fraud, served a reduced sentence after cooperating in another case. The conviction involved a shell company that took investment money for overseas projects that didn't exist. The amount was in the 6 figures. Fraud and early morning meetings with my fiancée didn't mix well in my head. Affairs are bad enough, but adding someone like him meant the stakes were different. I thought about the odd withdrawals I'd seen in our joint account over the past month. Small amounts, $200 here, $350 there, just under the threshold that triggers an alert. If she was funneling money to him, the reason mattered less than stopping it before it got worse. But if I showed my hand too early, she could clean up her trail before I understood it. I needed proof that connected the two of them in more than just the hours before dawn. That's when I decided to widen the surveillance. The backyard cameras were good for catching her leaving, but I needed to know what happened when she wasn't with me during the day. I bought a GPS tracker small enough to fit in the lining of her car trunk. It took less than a minute to slip it in while she was in the shower. The first 2 days of data were boring: work, gym, grocery store. On the third day, the route shifted. After leaving the office at 4:45 p.m., she drove across town to an industrial park. She stayed there for an hour, then drove home. The next day, same place, slightly shorter visit. I pulled up a map and street view. The building was a 2-story office block with a faded sign for WCS Imports, a company that, according to a quick search, had been dissolved last year. The name caught my attention because in Colin's court records, WCS Imports had been one of the shell companies he used for the fraud charges. I didn't believe in coincidences anymore. I thought about just following her one evening, but that risked being seen. Instead, I parked nearby at lunch the next day and watched the building. Traffic in and out was light, no more than a dozen people over 2 hours. At one point, Colin himself emerged, speaking to a man in a suit, and went back inside. No signage indicated a legitimate business. The blinds were drawn in every window. When I got home, Marissa was in the kitchen cooking pasta, cheerful in a way that felt rehearsed. She asked about my day, kept the conversation surface level, and didn't mention her afternoon. I nodded and played along, my mind already working on the next step. I called Daniel again, told him I needed more. He suggested getting access to her phone records. Not just the call logs she could delete, but the full carrier records. He walked me through setting up a request using my name as the account co-holder. When the records came in 3 days later, I scrolled through the list looking for patterns. 2 numbers stood out. One was Colin's cell, matching the plate data. The other was a prepaid burner number that didn't trace to any real name. She'd called that one almost every day for the past 2 months, often during lunch breaks or right before leaving the house at night. Texts to Colin were short, mostly arrangements about papers or checking the account. The kind of phrasing that could be explained away if you didn't know better. But with Colin's history, checking the account meant something I was sure wasn't innocent. The night after I read the logs, I decided to bait the hook. While Marissa was asleep, I used her phone to send Colin a message that read, "Tomorrow night, same place. Bring everything." Then I deleted it from the visible messages, but not from the carrier record. I needed him to believe it was her idea. The plan was simple. I'd be the one waiting. I set the alarm for 3:30 a.m. and let the house sit with its silence for a few minutes before I moved. The message I had sent from her phone gave Colin a time without saying it out loud. Tomorrow night, same place. The same place meant the fence line by the lilacs, the corner where the alley meets our back lot. If he was cautious, he would arrive early and watch before stepping out. If he was reckless, he would follow his pattern. Either way, I needed angles. Daniel parked half a block away with a clear view down the alley. He had a dash cam already rolling and a handheld camera with a better lens. I left the back light off, pulled a dark cap low, and slipped out through the side gate at 3:50. I kept to the neighbor's hedge and took a position that gave me both cover and a clean look at the path. The camera under the eave already watched the gate. I wanted the man himself on a better sensor than a doorbell chip. At 3:57 a.m., sedan eased to a stop at the mouth of the alley. The engine cut. The door opened and closed like someone closing a cupboard after midnight. A figure separated from the car and walked toward the fence with the same stiff gait I had watched on my phone. He paused in the dark band as always, letting his eyes adjust, giving himself time to listen. He waited for the sound of our back door. It didn't come. I stepped out and let him see a silhouette where he expected hers. The moment punched a hole in his routine. He froze, recalculated, and then tried to salvage the meeting with a bland opening line I could read from the shape of his mouth and hands. I didn't answer. I kept my distance, held my phone low with voice memo running, and let him talk into the quiet. He asked why I wasn't alone. He asked where we were going. He acted like a man who had brought everything, which was what I wanted to confirm. He shifted the tote bag in his right hand. It was the same cheap canvas I had seen in the industrial park. The bag mattered more than anything he could say. I kept the silence long enough to force him to fill it with hints. He referenced papers and account checks and said he couldn't stand in the open. I took a slow step back toward the corner of the yard that the exterior camera covered best, turning my shoulders so he would follow. He did, head still slightly down, face turned away from the street. When we were in the camera's box, I asked a single question in a flat voice, the kind a stranger could use, whether the documents were complete. He said everything we needed was signed and that the bank wouldn't push back after the next transfer. Not a confession in court, maybe, but a clear line for the bank fraud unit to follow. I told him to leave the bag at the base of the fence, then go. He hesitated the way a person does when his hands and brain disagree. For a second I thought he would bolt. Then he set the bag down, stepped backward, and asked if we were still on for the afternoon. I didn't answer. He retreated to the alley, kept his walk steady, climbed into the sedan, and pulled away without lights until he reached the cross street. I waited, counted to 40, then picked up the tote. Paper has a weight that telegraphs trouble. The bag was heavy enough to make my arm want to swing. I didn't go inside. I passed it to Daniel at his car, so his dashcam would capture the handoff. He opened it under the dome light and slid a stack of manila folders across the seat. On top, a draft contract authorizing discretionary transfers from my savings account to an entity labeled Westbridge Consulting, the kind of generic name scammers give a mailbox. Below that, a limited power of attorney drawn to my name, with a signature that wasn't mine. The forgery was good enough for someone who had only seen my signature on a rental application. It would not stand up next to my passport card. Deeper in the stack were photocopies. My driver's license, my bank debit card, front and back. A screenshot of my online banking dashboard with partial account numbers visible. That one wasn't a photocopy. It was a printout from a phone screenshot. The screen brightness bar was visible at the top edge. The thought landed hard. At some point, Marissa had stood inside our house, accessed my wallet or my desk, and given him images of my ID. She didn't need to pick a lock. She needed to make sure I was in the shower, or on a run, or grabbing groceries. There were also deposit slips filled out in neat handwriting I recognized as hers from notes on the fridge, the looping R, the impatient S. And at the bottom, a sheet that looked like a practice page where she had copied my signature a dozen times. The first attempts wobbled. The later ones carried my rhythm too closely for comfort. No more guessing. She hadn't stumbled into a bad idea and then panicked. She had practiced. We photographed everything in the car and then repacked the tote. I didn't want him to realize the bag had been intercepted. If he thought she had the paperwork, he'd continue his pattern. The more he repeated his routine, the cleaner the record for the bank and, eventually, a detective who would not have to be convinced with theories. I followed him after he left the alley. Daniel stayed put with the bag, ready to return it to the usual drop if needed. I kept a reasonable distance, no sudden moves, no aggressive tail, and let my GPS tracker keep honesty in the equation. He drove across town to the same industrial park where I had watched him earlier in the week. He entered through the rear lot, parked by the dumpster, and went inside the glass door with a key. The sign above the door had no company name, just a suite number. The blinds were still closed in every window, even though the sky was starting to gray. I parked on the street, walked like a person who belonged in a place where no one looks at one another before coffee, and did a slow loop around the building. The dumpsters had fresh liner bags and a recycling bin that hadn't been emptied since the day before. I lifted the lid and found exactly what I hoped existed. Discarded drafts, crumpled envelopes, a shredded paper bag torn open by some raccoon that did me a favor. One of the envelopes had our address printed by a postage meter and then crossed out in black marker. Another had a return address for WCS imports, which should not have been active for anything, let alone mail. I pulled 3 stacks of paper from the bin and slid them into a shopping bag I had brought on purpose to look ordinary. I returned to the car, locked the doors, and started sorting. There were intake forms that listed Marissa as a consultant. There were notes in Colin's hand that referenced test transfers, with dates that matched the small withdrawals I'd flagged. If you want to see how a theft grows, you look for language like test. It means the next number will be larger when the first one clears. There were bank routing worksheets with my bank's name in a blank space. One page listed my mother's maiden name spelled almost right. He didn't know the second capital letter. I photographed every page, front and back, then rearranged them to look like an animal had dragged them around, which wasn't far from the truth. I put the worst-looking stack back in the recycling, kept the rest, and left the lot the same way I arrived. On the drive home, I had to keep pulling my mind back from the edge where you start narrating your own anger like a sport. Anger gets you seen. Precision keeps you safe. The precision here was simple. This was no longer just a night walk. This was an organized attempt to move my money under the cover of a relationship, with documents staged to ease bank friction if a teller ever asked the wrong question. The morning meetings were rehearsals for the bigger stage. He carried the bag. She made the inside parts happen. I didn't confront her that day. I didn't even let my routine bend at the edges. I brewed coffee, sent 2 emails about nothing, and went to the bank branch A instead of the one closer to the office because branch A's manager had once helped me flag a phishing attempt on my business account. I asked for an appointment with the fraud specialist. I didn't show them the entire story yet. I wanted my report filed with a clean timeline and professional copies, not phone photos under a dome light. They scheduled me for the next morning with an investigator who handled account compromise cases. That night at home, I stayed quiet and watched for signs that Colin had noticed the bag had taken a detour. None came. Marissa kept the surface level smooth, made dinner, scrolled through her phone, turned it face down when I walked past, and went to bed early. At 3:58 a.m., she didn't move. At 4:07 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text on her line from the burner, a short question about whether everything was set. She didn't wake. I took a screenshot and saved it to the same drive as the rest. At first light, I met Daniel at a coffee shop and we synced our files. His dashcam had captured Colin's car plate clean as a product shot and the moment he set the tote down by our fence. My exterior camera had him mentioning the next transfer. My interior camera had Marissa leaving the earlier nights and returning at times that matched the burner logs. The recycling bin papers gave us a paper trail that connected WCS imports to current activity. Nothing explosive by itself. Together, enough to move a bank to lock doors. We agreed on one more step before the bank meeting. I wanted a shot of the office interior without stepping across a line that would make a defense attorney smile. Daniel found a public hallway camera in the building directory that streamed to an unsecured local page. It took him 6 minutes at the table with his laptop to pull a still image from that feed. The timestamp showed Colin walking into Suite 214 with the same tote bag 2 hours after he left my fence. A small thing, but it stitched the morning together. I went home with a folder thick enough to feel like a plan. The house smelled like her shampoo in the bathroom and garlic in the kitchen. She asked if I wanted to do something that weekend. I said sure in a voice that didn't betray the schedule I had for the morning. A fraud report at 9, followed by the kind of phone calls that make people step carefully around words like warrant. The trap had worked. He had brought everything. And in trying to make my signature his, they had left their own all over the page. The bank's fraud unit met me in a small conference room at 9 o'clock sharp. The investigator, a man with the kind of clipped sentences you hear from someone who has worked both sides of a teller counter, looked through my folder without rushing. He spread the documents out like pieces of a map, the forged signature page, the limited power of attorney, the screenshots of my ID, the phone records. He asked about the tote bag's chain of custody, and I explained the cameras, Daniel's dashcam, the timestamps. When I got to Colin's record and the WCS imports connection, his eyebrows lifted. This, he said, tapping the contract with the false signature, is felony territory. He stepped out, returned with a colleague from the bank's legal team, and they began taking photos of every page with an evidence camera. They didn't ask me to leave. When they were finished, they asked if I wanted the account frozen entirely or restricted to my signature only. I chose the latter. I wanted activity to stop on anything she could reach, but I needed to keep my business account fluid. They assured me any attempt to move funds without my authorization would be flagged and reported. By noon, the bank had already filed a report with the local police department's financial crimes division. I was told a detective would contact me within 48 hours, but the investigator hinted that with the volume of evidence, things could move faster. I went home and said nothing to Marissa. I wanted her to think she was still in control. She was on the couch, laptop open, smiling faintly at something she read. She asked about my morning. I told her I had errands. That night, she didn't leave at 4 a.m. She stayed in bed. The burner phone sent another short text. Tomorrow, same? And she replied while half under the blanket. I saved the message through the carrier portal before she could delete it. The next day, a plainclothes detective called and asked if I could come to the station that afternoon. I brought everything. Printed photos, the USB drive with videos, Daniel's dashcam footage, the recycling bin documents. In the interview room, they played Colin's recorded alley conversation and had me confirm it was my voice asking about the documents. They paused at the moment he mentioned the bank transfer. That, the detective said, is the kind of line prosecutors like to hear. By evening, they had drafted 2 warrants, one for Colin's office suite, another for Marissa's phone and home electronics. They moved fast because financial evidence ages badly. Once people suspect discovery, they wipe devices and close accounts. The warrants were served the following morning. I stayed in the house as 2 officers knocked and announced themselves. Marissa opened the door in sweatpants, hair tied back, expecting maybe a delivery. When she saw the badges, her face froze in a way I'd never seen. They stepped in, read the warrant aloud, and began collecting her laptop, her phone, even the little portable drive she kept in her nightstand. She tried to ask questions, but the detective kept his tone neutral. repeating that she would have a chance to speak at the station. Across town, another team hit Colin's office. The detective later told me they found blank checks with my account number, more forged documents, and a list of names, likely other targets. Colin was arrested on site. Marissa was taken in for questioning. She didn't come home that night. I changed the locks before dark. The next morning, her sister called to say Marissa was trying to explain everything, that she'd been pressured by Colin. I didn't answer. The bank investigator emailed to confirm the account restrictions had blocked a $4,800 transfer attempt at 3:17 a.m., just hours after the warrants were served. By the end of the week, charges had been filed: conspiracy to commit bank fraud, possession of forged documents, identity theft. Colin faced additional counts for violating his parole. The engagement, obviously, was over. I boxed her belongings, labeled them, and had them ready for her sister to collect. She didn't come herself. The last time I saw her was 3 weeks later in a courthouse hallway, her hair flat, wearing county-issued beige. She didn't make eye contact. Daniel and I turned over all our remaining files to the detective for trial prep. The prosecutor later told me the video of Colin dropping the tote bag and naming the bank transfer was the strongest piece of evidence. The kind of thing jurors remember, he said. Colin eventually pled out, taking a 7-year sentence in exchange for cooperation in other cases. Marissa accepted a plea deal: 18 months in state prison, 3 years probation, and a permanent record that would follow her into every job interview. The house felt different after that. Not better, not worse, just mine again. I kept the cameras up, not because I expected someone to come back, but because I liked the certainty of knowing who came and went. The most satisfying part wasn't the arrest or the sentencing. It was watching the accounts stay untouched, the balance unmoved, the quiet confirmation that they had failed before they could make the real hit. The trap had closed, and for once, I had been the one holding the rope. And that's the story. If you're still here, that means you're one of us. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I drop new chaos every single day, and trust me, tomorrow's story, it's even worse than this one.